Greetings ladies and mental gents, and welcome to my channel, where I like to make audio narrations of various stories from the internet. In this video, we will be focusing on a story from the subreddit HFY, called Be Ready, written by Regal Legal Eagle. The link to the original story will be down below, and, as always, I hope that you enjoy. Be ready, Greg held out his hand to try and shield his face from the dust and dirt being blown into his face, ever thankful for his mask that protected him. Even so, he couldn't see anything in the storm. The goddamn weather satellites were on the fritz again, so he didn't get any sort of warning before the dust storm had hit him. He sealed up his buggy and proceeded on foot, trying to make it to the nearest shelter so that he could wait out the storm in a little bit more comfort than his buggy. He knew that the shelter had only been 2 miles away, but it was almost 3 hours later when he found the damn thing. A combination of walking up a hill through the storm and then missing the building and having to circle back. Finally, he saw the outline ahead of him and picked up his pace. He quickly tapped the code into the keypad, and it slid open as he squeezed through the opening sideways and quickly hit the button on the other side to make it close behind him. This way, he let in as little dirt as possible. As he stood there, looking down at the dirt that had blown in around him, he sighed, but was more than happy to reach up and peel off his mask off his face. The air was recycled, the pump straining to filter out the dirt, but he was fine with that. It beat breathing the grit in through his mask. His filters were good, but they were never meant to try and work with a dirt storm. His hair was now mostly dirt, which wasn't a thrilling prospect. But that was a part of the price that he knew he'd pay when he signed up for this job. Being part of the first team to terraform a planet was going to be hard work, and he knew it. Once he'd shaken the worst of the dirt out of his hair and unzipped his duster, hanging it up on the hook next to the door, and looked across the way to the massive sign bolted to the wall of the shelter. It read, "2 possibilities. We're alone, or we are not. Either way, be ready." This was a clear credo of the team, be ready. When he had first signed up, he expected some cheesy quote about hope, or building a future, or something along those lines. He hadn't expected be ready, but it was actually a pretty good idea. They were alone out here. The entire team consisted of 200 people on the planet, and another 50 in space. When mankind managed to finally send probes to the neighboring systems, they didn't find anything, but they'd expected that. But no one had expected was that they kept searching, and they kept finding nothing. No aliens, no signals, no ruins. They hadn't even found planets with life more complicated than algae on them. This was a problem since Earth was getting so crowded, so a choice had to be made. Keep searching and hope that they got lucky, or start changing. They chose the latter, since FTL drives were expensive, and skip drives were even more expensive. And internal dampeners were the most expensive. They had to be very, very careful with how they started. First, they had chosen a planet. AM401 had been chosen, an Earth's gravity planet, which was also roughly the same size. The atmosphere was weaker, and the ocean had a fraction of the algae and plankton found on Earth, with nothing bigger living on it. Not to mention a weak-ass moon and an ugly, misshapen captured asteroid just half the size of the moon back home. They called it the kidney bean. After they picked up the planet, they had to pick the team. 250 people had been handpicked from various backgrounds and specialties to fill every job that they needed. They'd launched off the several cargo drones and nothing but automated systems to touch down on the planet. And then, a single ship with life support. Of the 250, all but 5 were put into cold sleep. The rest had to keep everyone alive on the 4-year trip to the planet. And it was one-way trip since they couldn't carry enough fuel to make it back. Once there, they would be woken up and be split everyone across the planet. 250 people to monitor all the automated equipment that had been set up on the planet the size of Earth. That was all that they could afford to fit on one life-sustaining ship that was fast enough to get here in 4 years. An additional 100,000 people had been loaded onto massive sleeper ship and sent with the standard FTL drives, set to arrive in 50 years. And another 5 of those ships were set to arrive 5 years after the first one showed up. This team had to have the planet capable of sustaining life in that time. And while 50 years sounded like a lot, they had a lot of work to do. AM-401 was nearly a dead planet, with barely any plankton, and some algae here and there. No grass, no trees, no plants, no nothing. They had to strengthen the atmosphere, start growing plants, and seed the oceans with life in 50 years. On top of all of this, they had to fight the environment, boredom, and of course entropy. They all knew that some of them would die before the colonists arrive, and those that survive would have very little life left to enjoy the work once they were done. But this was a volunteer program. They knew what they signed up for. The atmosphere generators were spaced out around the planet in teams of 5, and the 50 in the space split amongst all the small ships to start building orbital stations and satellites. Everyone else had to patrol the sector of the ground or ocean and keep everything working. The massive sea crawlers, chemsowers, and river carvers had to be maintained and regularly checked on to make sure that the programming held. He had Territory 88, which consisted of the western portion of one of the northern continents. It was roughly the size of the Pacific Northwest back on Earth, and it had just a little patch of land all to himself. He didn't have an atmosphere generator in his section, and the person assigned to patrol the ocean along his coastline was based on an island, so he hadn't seen another human face since meeting up with Lucy from Sector 87 on New Year's 6 months ago. They were allowed one alcoholic beverage apiece, and he'd given her a rock shaped like a fish that he had found. She'd given him a rock shaped like a bird the year before, so he thought it was fair. In 3 weeks, he'd meet up with Larry from Sector 75 to the south, and they'd grill something if everyone went well. He was looking forward to it, especially since that's when he allowed his next shower. They had a ration of clean water until the ocean seeding was done, and they could start irrigation and water treatment. And the atmosphere was still too weak to permit rain, so all the water just sat in the ocean. These were just a few of the reasons that he figured be ready was the creed of the mission. They needed to make sure that they didn't program the machines wrong. Their courses were correct, that they wouldn't slip up and roll their buggy down the cliff. Anything like that. If they hurt themselves bad enough, they were wrecked. So he had to be ready to prevent it from happening, or be ready to fix it on his own. He was at least 3 days' drive from the nearest person, and that was in good weather. When the storm raging, he couldn't even call for help. So for now he sighed and looked around the shelter. The 2 bunks were where they were supposed to be. He walked up to the cupboards and opened them, picking up a list from the wall. Canned corn, beans, meat, beets, soup. Everything was left as the last time that he'd used the shelter. Setting the list back, he walked to the sink, pulling one of the 2 glasses that held on the shelf from under it and the faucet before turning it on. He ran it for a few seconds, held up the slightly grainy-looking water with a frown, and then pulled his analyzer from his belt. It beeped after a second, informing him that the water was the same as before. So he shrugged and took a sip of the grainy tap water. Well, he'd been ready. Then he groaned and sat down on one of the 2 chairs around the small table and listened to the howling wind outside. He wished he'd been able to bring his music. The computer on the ship had been corrupted, and to everyone's dismay they'd lost almost all the programmed music. One of the techs had managed to save a phonograph files for music before 1950, although no one knew why it was in the computer for the first place. So people had broken protocol and got some of the mission's 3D printers to make up basic record players and clay records. The clay records didn't last long, but they could always be make more. This planet had plenty of mud after all. The director hadn't protested, because you could ask humans to live in near isolation for 50 years, but if you asked them to do it without music, they'd mutiny. For now his records were in the sealed box in his buggy, and he was left alone in the shelter with the wind. Greg let out a slow, heavy sigh and kicked his feet up onto the table. Listening to the howling all around him, he had been 25 when he'd entered the cold sleep. He wasn't sure the 4 years in cold sleep counted, but he'd been at this job for 5 years now. 45 years to go. He'd be 75 when the first sleeper ship arrived. He'd probably be dead, but he didn't mind it if everything went well. When he was alone and bored, he'd like to close his eyes, picturing his sector of this planet. Where would the people set up the towns and homes? He figured that one bay might be popular. What would they call the town? The mountains further north would be the great for skiing. Humans living on a planet orbiting another star. It made him smile. But his quiet was suddenly interrupted. Something was tapping on the wall of the shelter. He opened his eyes and looked over with a frown. Had the wind gotten strong enough to toss rocks? He heard it again. Clank, clank, clank. From behind the Be Ready sign, Greg stood up, unsure what he was hearing. Clank, clank, clank. Clank, clank, clank. Something was tapping on the outside of the shelter, moving along the wall, and then the other as it got closer to the door. He started his internal keypad and quickly took the command into lock it, and then he stood back and tapped. The sound got closer. Clank, clank, clank. Finally, the sound of the tapping on the door. Was it someone else on a mission, lost in his sector? They would have told him when they were coming over. Right? Clank, clank, clank. The sound was right at the door on the other side. The keypad was out there. If it was a human, all they had to do was type on it, and he'd see them from his side. But no one used the keypad. Clank, clank, clank. The tapping got louder along the door. Greg gulped and looked over his shoulder at the sign. Be ready. Greg quickly pulled his mask on, grabbing his plasma welder as he turned it on. Starting at the top of the door, he began to weld it together. Clank, clank, clank. Something was beating on the door now. He continued to fuse the metal of the door together in his way down the line, backing away once it was sealed. He didn't pull off his mask this time. Clank, clank, clank. The sound was stronger than ever, as if something was very firmly knocking on the outside of his door. Something that had found him in a dirt storm, on a planet that was supposed to be void of any native life bigger than plankton. Greg was breathing hard through his dirty filters as he stared at the door. He was the only human in 1,000 miles, and he didn't know what was out there. But it wasn't human. Clank, clank, clank. The shelter shook as little as something slammed into the door. Greg stepped over to his duster, pulling it back on as he waited, welder in hand, although he had no idea what to do with it. He kept waiting for the sound again. A minute passed. 5. Clank, clank, clank. He groaned out and watched, counting the seconds in his head. Sure enough, every 5 minutes something beat against the door. Was it testing the metal? It hadn't cracked or bent, but it was a few inches thick. 5 minutes was that howling wind, and then clank, clank, clank. Then just went again. Greg stared at the door that he'd welded shut and gulped. Then he sat down in his chair again and stared. The tapping went on for 2 hours, every 5 minutes for the whole 2 hours. But after those 2 hours he counted out another 5 minutes, and nothing tapped. He sat up a little straighter and kept counting. Half an hour passed, and the howling wind around the shelter finally eased, and then stopped. He looked at the local time. Midnight. It would be dark, very dark, since the kidney bean moon provided such bad light. He didn't feel like going out there right now. He shifted and settled in his chair and finally allowed himself to close his eyes. It felt like he was floating out in space. Blackness around him. He heard a whisper somewhere behind him. But when he turned, it was still behind him. He heard a skittering sound, and something crawled over his feet. He cursed and tried to walk, but his legs moving but nothing touching the ground. Something crawled up his legs and whispering grew even stronger. Don't belong. He growled and kicked his legs even harder as nothing happened. You belong home. On Earth, go home. Die there. The voice was whispering to him, but for some reason, that was what triggered him. He screamed out, filled with anger and rage as the light beamed from his eyes. The darkness was washed away, and he saw the floor covered with insects. He yelled and began to stomp on them, kicking them free of his legs. "Feck, you!" was only his answer to the whisper before he suddenly jerked his eyes open. He was still in the shelter, hungry, but awake. There wasn't even any more howling. He quickly stood up, bringing up his welder once more. This time he cut the door back open, unlocking it and tapping the console. The door ground open and stepped out, welder still in hand. Looking around, he still saw dirt, but when he looked down, he saw the marks of some sort, something dragging through the dirt. The outside of the door behind him was covered in single point marks, as if something had been tapping on the points with its claws. He shut the door and locked it with the keypad before he began to jog towards his buggy. The 2 miles that took him 3 hours in the storm was about 20 minutes as he navigated the broken terrain of the hill. He could see the buggy near the base, since all there was around there was dirt, rocks, and some more dirt. When he got down to it, he slowly walked around it, but he didn't see any of those strange tracks near it. But the vehicle was completely covered in dirt. He pulled out a shovel off of his back and scraped the windows clean of dirt. Then he climbed up on top, inspecting the exhaust, then the intake valves, brushing dirt off of them. After that, he scraped the front intake free of dirt as well, before satisfied that it was ready to drive. Putting the shovel back into its case, he climbed up into the driver's seat and turned the buggy on. As soon as he had, there were alarms sounding throughout the cabin of his computer came back to life. He cursed as he read the laundry list of warnings. All his long-range comm towers were down. 3 seed crawlers were offline from the storm. 2 shelters were marked as damage. There had been some sort of earthquake to the north, it seemed. Then his eyes focused on the lost in the warning list. There was a giant red circle centered around the mountains to the north. Seismic activity had been detected. Local sensors were detecting massive build-ups of pressure and heat. He took a deep breath and read on. Volcanic activity detected. Most of the range was situated in a fissure that they had somehow missed. If the sensors were correct, it was a supervolcano, the size of Yellowstone, and it was preparing to erupt. Wasn't there supposed to be a way to stop this sort of thing? He cursed softly as he opened up his glove box, pulling out an emergency manual. Flipping through, he had all the scrolled ways until they got to volcano. And then he looked up the diagram at the back and he put his computer console. If he drilled into something near the base, it would be able to vent out the magma. He was going to have to try. Scrolling back over his map, he saw that the River Carver GX-39 was near the base of the mountains, but it wasn't responding. He cursed as he tapped on his console. No signal, unit unresponsive. He cursed again and then looked further up. There was another GX-41. He tapped on it, but he got the same thing. No signal, unit unresponsive. Feck this. He cursed and tossed the emergency manual back into the glove box, slamming it shut before he set his buggy into gear. His eyes kept moving over the bleak brown terrain as he drove over the broken ground heading north. It would take him a good 5 hours of bumpy driving. He'd head past the bay and swing up on the River Carver to get activated and then drive around the base of the mountains to get the second one. He just wished that he could make a call to let someone know what he was doing. Greg shook and bounced as he drove, the bad terrain making his buggy bounce around as he drove. But he made himself remember, be ready. He needed to drive fast, but if he got stuck, then it was all for nothing. It took him just over 4 hours before he found the wide track left by the River Carver. Without rain, there were just dry beds for now. So he drove into it and began to cruise up until the massive machine that he could see in the distance. It was as big as some sports stadiums back home. A massive tracked vehicle with drills and buckets to dig irrigation paths. But instead of crawling along and dragging up the ground behind it, this one was just sitting there. Near the base, he saw tracks and gulped, bringing his buggy to a halt in the dry riverbed. Jumping out of his buggy, he thought over what might be waiting for him. Then grit his teeth and pulled out a fire axe off of the back of his buggy. Hefting it in his hands, he looked up at the silent, towering machine before him. He activated the headlight on his side of the mask and began running forward under the treads. He saw more of those strange dragging claw marks in the dirt. The door at the base of the machine had been left open, it looked like. Not pausing, he ran through those doors, finding the interior of the machine cold and dead. The hallways had scratch marks all along the walls, but he didn't have time to think it over or wait, so he just rushed forward. He was climbing up the stairs, heading to the control center in the middle of the machine when he heard something ahead. He slowed down, walking quietly along the hall as he heard something trashing the control room just around the corner. He closed his eyes for a moment and secured his grip on the fire axe, and then he charged. Inside the control room was a creature trying to tear apart the computer console that it could. It had legs, way too many legs, but it was a fat slug body pressed into the deck. 2 long claws extended from another set of limbs further up towards his head. When it turned to him, it was looking at 4 black eyes arrayed around a circular mouth full of teeth. Greg screamed and the creature screamed, revealing another fat white-eyed beyond the rows of teeth. Greg swung his axe, and it tried to scurry back, but Greg was faster, bringing the axe down on its limbs as purple gunk flowed free. He began to chop wildly, screaming the entire time as he reduced the creature to flesh chunks, all spewed that purple ichor. Once it was over, he was breathing hard, his axe, arms and chest straining on that purple crap. Then he looked over at the consoles, rushing to the back of the control room to open up the storage locker. Pulling out the replacement parts, he quickly repaired the consoles that he would need, turning his welder down to solder pieces back into place and finish up. Once that was done, he frantically activated the machine, waiting for it to power up and before it cycled through the systems, checking then off as they came online. Human. He looked around and then down at the console's radio. You must not do this. Your species was meant to live and die in your home system. It's pure arrogance to think that you should leave. The planets that did not grow their own life are meant to be dead. We will purge this attempt to make life. We have waited centuries in case you should try. You will not succeed. Greg didn't even pay attention. He was already getting the machine running and setting what he had figured would be its last track into the automated computer before it started to rumble forward towards the mountains ahead. Human, you will fail. This planet will remain dead. The voice was yelling as they left the control room, turning around to weld the door into the command center shut. Rushing back down and out of the crawler, he slowed, hefting his axe in his hand as he scanned the area. Be ready. But nothing stirred, aside from the machine above him. Quickly, he jogged back to his buggy, tossing his axe into the passenger seat and climbing in. As the machine began to rumble forward, he was already picking up speed, driving east to swing around the bottom of the mountain range and up to the second river culver. His radio picked up a signal, and he tuned it out. Human, you need to under. He turned it off, and he drove to another 2 hours down and around the edge of the mountains. He could see the smoke rising from some of the peaks, and he checked his computer. The first river carver had started to drill, but he didn't know if one hole would release enough pressure. He kept driving up and over the hills and ridges, skidding around rocks and bouncing along as his stomach growled heavily at him. He could eat if he survived this. However, when it crested the hill, he saw another of those slug spiders. It saw him just as his buggy slammed into its fat body. Purple smeared up over the windshield, and he cursed, swerving as he felt his buggy turn and roll. Quickly, he grabbed his axe in one hand, trying to hold it down as his vehicle rolled over and over and over. When it came to a stop, he was upside down, groaning as he unfastened his restraints and then kicked the door open. He crawled out with his axe in hand, but saw no more of those creatures. The machine was in the distance, and the smoke pouring from the mountains was growing thicker. Reaching back into the flipping buggy, he pulled out of his supply crate and strapping the box to his back and making sure that he hit his welder before gripping the axe in his hands and running forward. He saw more of those tracks near the base of the machine, and he ran inside to open doors. But one of those creatures was waiting. It lunged at him from the darkness, knocking him onto his back, the supply crate bopping him up. But it hissed and snapped at his face, but he held up his axe, keeping it from getting him. And he couldn't force it off of him though, so he had to press up with his axe in one hand and quickly shove his welder into its face. It didn't have time to pull back before he turned it on, and it screamed for a second as its face blistered and burned. It twitched and jerked, and Greg cried out as one of those claws sank into his shoulder before it fully died. But then he could shove the slug off his body and get up. He groaned as he felt the pain in his shoulder, the blood seeping down his duster, but he ignored it and rushed forwards once more. There wasn't any noise coming from the control room this time, but as he charged into it, he saw the damage had already been done. Before he could look behind him, though, something slammed into his supply crate. He staggered forward and was pulled around a little by the straps of his crate. He heard the creature behind him gargling in anger. It had sunk those claws into the crate, thinking it was part of Greg. Quickly, Greg pulled free of the straps and turned as he swung his axe, cleaving the thing's head off in a single sweep. As it slumped, the purple ichor spewed out, and he was already shoving it into the hall and closing the door to the control room. The parts were scattered all around the room, and it found the spares in the back. He looked over and cursed. He could fix the main components, but there was no way that he could get the automatic systems back up. He just shook his head and pulled the parts from his supply crate and started to fix the control room back up. He heard something moving in the hall and quickly locked the door, welding it shut from the inside before turning back to his work. There was a hissing as the creature slammed into the door, but it howled. Once he got the systems back up and running, he turned it on and the machine hummed to life. Quickly, he started moving it forward, drilling into the base of the mountain. He didn't know how long he had, but he was moving as fast as possible to punch another hole into the volcano before it went critical. The radio sparked to life. "Human, you can't do this. You have to leave the planet dead. Only gods can create life. You're committing sacrilege." Quickly, he turned the radio off and drilled into the mountain. Soon, there was nothing but the floodlights on the machine itself looking ahead into the drill paths as he cut through the stone, looking at the computer console to aim the thing where he needed it to go. In half an hour, he'd drill a hole the size of a stadium into the mountain. Ahead, he could see the steam coming from the rocks. The barrier between his hole and the molten rock beyond was very thin. Thinking it over, he started to back the machine out, knowing that the pressure would break the barrier and the lava would come pouring out soon enough. He backed the machine out, but he started to turn it away from the hole and up the mountain. Out of the path of the lava, something loud snapped and broke somewhere in the machine. It ground to a halt, and he saw the flashing light regarding the engine failure. The creatures? But it didn't matter. Soon the hillside would be covered in molten rock. His buggy was flipped, this machine wouldn't budge, and running on foot would be suicide. He let out a heavy sigh then, slumping into the command chair. He might survive here. The control room was well protected. What were these chances? 50-50? 1 in 10? He shrugged and stood up and walked over to his supply crate as he opened it up. The creature had pierced these records, it seemed. Wait. He had one left. He smiled and stood and walked to the back of the control room as he found a machine that the creature hadn't noticed. He set the record into place, flipping the switch to the surface, and began to turn the needle, and he picked up the tiny bumps. It was scratchy, but he could hear the music just fine. "I see trees of green, red roses too." The lava began to bubble out of the hole he dug, and he sat down in the control chair, propping his feet up on the console. As he closed his eyes, he listened to the music and wondered, what would they name the bay? Would it be a resort town, an industrial center? Maybe they'd set up a university out there, study the volcanoes. It was a shame that he couldn't warn the others, but he knew that they'd be all right. They were ready. humanity always was. Stacy had been playing around at the park with her mom and dad and her stupid little brother. It had been a good day, nice and warm. Not too warm, though, since the nice breeze kept the white puffy clouds swimming through the sky. As she pushed through some of the bushes while wandering around, she saw a big statue. It was a guy leaning back against the stone. He was smiling as he looked over the bay. She wondered who he was. There was a big plaque underneath the base of it, and she read the name Greg before she heard her mom. "Stacy, food's ready. Where'd you go?" "Coming, Mom," the girl called out, turning and running out of the little hidden spot to meet up with her family. They made her favorite lunch. She found out who the statue guy was later. End of story. If you enjoyed this story and wish to support the author, the link is down below. If you would like to support this channel, there are numerous ways to do so. They will also be listed in the description down below. But the easiest way to help this channel is to share it, subscribe, and like. And, as always, I will see you all in the next video, and I hope that you have a good one. Cheers!